The sound of Georgy Girl once floated across continents. A melody so light, so hopeful, it seemed impossible that silence could ever follow. Yet, in 2022, Australia awoke to a different sound. The quiet of mourning. A voice that had carried the dreams of a generation was gone. Picture the late 1960s. Radios crackled in lounge rooms from Melbourne to Manchester. Families sat huddled around the television as the seekers smiled into the lens. Judith Durham's voice, clear, bell-like, unshaken, cut through static and distance. It wasn't just another pop act. For Australia, she was the proof that a small island nation on the edge of the world could sing back to the empire and be heard. And then, decades later, the news bulletins broke. ABC anchors shifted tone, their words weighed down. Judith Durham had passed away at 79. It was more than an obituary. It was as if the nation itself exhaled, realizing how much of its identity had been entwined with that singular voice. This is a story anchored in Australia, not only in the folk clubs of Melbourne or the stages of London, but in the cultural fabric that stretches from suburban songbooks to national pride. Durham was not just another singer. She was the first Australian woman whose voice reached #1 in Britain, whose group sold more than 50 million records, whose presence at Expo 67 in Montreal made headlines back home. But why does her story matter now? Because it is not just about music. It is about what happens when a nation projects its hope onto a single voice, and what it feels like when that voice finally fades. Her death in 2022 was not simply the loss of a performer. It was the closing of a chapter in Australia's cultural coming of age. So we ask, how did Judith Durham become the voice of the seekers? The angelic sound of a generation? And how did the journey from the blinding lights of Wembley to a quiet farewell in Melbourne shape her legacy? Most of all, what secrets, what sacrifices lay hidden behind that radiant clarity? And what echoes remain today? Judith Durham was often called Australia's songbird, but the epithet only scratches the surface. She was more than a voice. She was a vessel of memory, a bridge between a young nation and the wider world. When she stood on stage with the Seekers, petite, modest, framed by 3 towering bandmates, she looked almost fragile. And then she sang, and the fragility dissolved. What emerged was strength, clear, unwavering, timeless. In an age dominated by the British invasion, the Seekers were an unlikely export. They were not brash rockers, not pop idols with wild scandals. They were polite, smiling, wholesome. Yet Judith's presence gave them something irresistible. It wasn't just the purity of tone. It was the way she seemed to lift audiences, as if she carried an invisible promise. That even from far-off Australia, dreams could rise and be heard. And yet, within that promise lay a tension. Fame does not come without its shadows. The applause was thunderous, but what happens after the ovation ends? When the costumes are folded away and the lights dim, what is left for the woman at the center? Imagine watching her on stage at Wembley in 1965, before tens of thousands. Her dress catching the light, her voice soaring above the roar. Could anyone in that crowd have guessed how much pressure weighed upon those shoulders? Could they have known that behind the grace she longed at times for quiet, for a life less scrutinized? Australia adored her. The world applauded her. But adoration can be a heavy crown. Judith Durham carried it with dignity, but no crown is without cost. This is where her story finds its contrasts. The radiance of fame set against the solitude of personal battles. the applause of thousands against the silence of one. It is in these contrasts that we begin to see the full shape of her life. Luminous, yes, but edged with sacrifice. So let us step back to the beginning. Before the international tours, before the gold records and the ovations at Melbourne's Meyer Music Bowl. Back to a young girl in Essendon, Melbourne, who first discovered that music could be both escape and destiny. Because if we want to understand how the nation mourned in 2022, we must first understand how a child of suburban Victoria became the voice of a generation. Long before the ovations at Wembley, before the platinum records lined her walls, Judith Durham was simply Judith Mavis Cock, a girl growing up in Essendon, Melbourne. The daughter of a World War II navigator and a devoted mother, her world was modest, yet filled with music. There was a piano in the house, and Judith's small hands first traced melodies on its keys, the notes stumbling, then flowing, then soaring. At school, her voice caught the attention of teachers. It wasn't just that she could sing in tune, it was that she could stop a room. Even in childhood, her tone carried an otherworldly clarity, like light refracted through glass. Family gatherings became her first concerts, her siblings and parents both audience and chorus. She learnt classical piano at Melbourne University Conservatorium and imagined herself one day playing in orchestras, perhaps tucked away at the back, invisible. Singing was never the plan. But fate has a way of nudging. Friends persuaded her to step up to a microphone at a jazz club in the 1950s. That night, smoky with saxophones and clinking glasses, a new destiny took shape. It was in those dimly lit clubs that Judith first felt the power of her own voice. Jazz standards flowed through her. Ella Fitzgerald, Peggy Lee, but transformed into something uniquely hers. Audiences would turn. Conversations would pause. The girl from Essendon was no longer background. She was the spotlight. And yet, she remained modest, almost shy. Friends remembered her reluctance to push herself forward. She wanted music, not fame. But Melbourne in the early 60s was shifting. Folk revival bands sprouted in cafes, and destiny placed her in the path of three young men: Athol Guy, Bruce Woodley, and Keith Potger. Together they would form the Seekers. Imagine it. Four young Australians, barely out of their teens, deciding to take their harmonies beyond the shores of home. They boarded a ship to Britain in 1964, thinking they would play a few shows and maybe cut a record. Instead, they became the first Australian band to storm the UK charts. But before the triumphs, there was still the young Judith, navigating the distance between a suburban childhood and the looming weight of expectation. Did she know then that the songs she carried would echo for decades? Did she sense that her crystalline tone would one day define an era? Her childhood had given her the motifs that would return again and again. The piano in the corner, the sense of modesty, the yearning for quiet even as the noise of the world grew. They were seeds, planted early, destined to bloom into both brilliance and burden. But that was only the beginning. By the mid-1960s, the Seekers were no longer just four young Australians taking a chance. They were a global phenomenon. In Britain, they were greeted with something close to hysteria. Crowds thronged outside theaters. Girls fainted in the front rows. Security had to hold fans back. It was Beatlemania with an Australian accent, and at the center stood Judith, her voice the beacon that made the harmonies unforgettable. Their breakthrough came with I'll Never Find Another You. Released in 1964, it sold more than 1 million copies in Britain alone, a staggering number for a group from Melbourne. It was the first Australian pop song to reach #1 on the UK charts. Overnight, they went from local folk singers to household names. The single topped charts in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. And in America, it reached the Billboard Top 5. Success rolled in waves. A world of our own. The carnival is over. Morningtown Ride. Each became an anthem. And then came Georgy Girl, a song that captured the buoyant optimism of the 1960s. The film tie-in pushed it into the Billboard Top 10 in the US. And in 1967, it was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song. The Seekers sold more than 50 million records worldwide. For an Australian act, it was unprecedented. Imagine Melbourne in 1967. At the Sydney Myer Music Bowl, 200,000 people gathered for a homecoming concert. 200,000. It remains one of the largest crowds ever assembled for a single concert in the Southern Hemisphere. The city itself seemed to tremble with applause. Judith, barely in her 20s, walked on stage in a simple dress, dwarfed by the sheer mass of humanity. When she began to sing, silence fell over the bowl, as if even the breeze held its breath. Awards followed. Australian of the Year in 1967 for the entire group. They became the first Australian band to top both UK and US charts. Their television specials on the BBC drew record audiences. Back home, their faces appeared on postage stamps. It was a new era for Australian culture, one where local artists no longer saw themselves as outsiders. Judith Durham's voice had made the world listen. And yet, with every triumph came foreshadowing. Fame brings a price. For Judith, the endless tours, the rehearsals, the interviews, all pressed against her natural shyness. Friends later recalled her yearning for quiet, for moments away from the glare. But at the time, the machine of success allowed little rest. The brighter the light, the deeper the shadow waiting at the edges. Was it happiness? Or was it a gilded cage? How does one balance the roar of 250,000 fans with the silence of a hotel room? Could anyone, even Judith herself, truly separate the joy of the music from the weight of expectation? For Australia, though, she was a symbol of possibility. When the country tuned into ABC radio or opened newspapers, there was Judith, proving that Australians could stand shoulder to shoulder with the world's best. She had become not only a singer, but a national treasure. But glory never tells the whole story. Behind the ovations, behind the chart-topping singles and the world tours, there lingered questions about identity, about sacrifice, about the toll of living as a symbol. And as the applause thundered louder, so too did the silence that waited once the curtain fell. For the world, Judith Durham was the golden voice of the Seekers, but behind the stage curtains lay challenges few could see. Fame may have looked gentle in her hands, but it was heavy all the same. Friends recalled that Judith, naturally modest, often felt overwhelmed by the constant attention. She was not drawn to the spotlight for its glare, only for the music. Yet the spotlight came anyway, relentless, demanding. Some reports suggested that the whirlwind of success left her struggling with sleepless nights and exhaustion. Endless tours, packed schedules, and the weight of expectation eroded the quiet life she once imagined at the piano. Others disputed that her struggles were visible to the outside world. To audiences, she remained a picture of composure. But those closest to her saw the strain, the way she sometimes longed for retreat, for silence. In 1968, at the height of their fame, Judith shocked fans by announcing her departure from the Seekers. She said she wanted to pursue classical training, to step away from the pop machinery. For many, it felt unthinkable. Why would someone leave a group selling millions, filling stadiums, adored across continents? Was it courage, or was it escape? Her life after the Seekers was marked by both reinvention and difficulty. She studied classical music, released solo albums, and explored jazz once more. Yet, her career never again reached the feverish peaks of the mid-60s. The world remembered her as the face of the Seekers, and in some ways, she seemed forever bound to that image. Personal trials deepened the shadows. In 1990, she and her husband Ron Edgeworth were involved in a terrible car accident near Melbourne. They survived, but Judith sustained injuries that affected her mobility for years. Only weeks later, Ron was diagnosed with motor neuron disease. Judith became his carer, standing beside him until his passing in 1994. The woman who had once stood before crowds of hundreds of thousands now faced the loneliest stage of all, the slow, heartbreaking decline of the man she loved. It was a period that tested her profoundly. Some friends recalled that she seemed a different person afterwards, still gracious, still resilient, but marked by sorrow. And yet, even in this darkness, her devotion to music and to her audience never disappeared. She returned to the Seekers for reunion tours, her voice aged but still crystalline, and fans wept at the sound. But questions lingered. Did Judith ever truly find peace beyond the roar of fame? Or was she forever caught between the applause she inspired and the silence she yearned for? The shadows in her story remind us, the brighter the career, the more invisible the burdens may be. And for Judith Durham, those burdens would shape the way her final chapter unfolded. A chapter the nation would never forget. It was August 5th, 2022. Winter hung over Melbourne with a gray chill, the kind that pressed against hospital windows and made the city move more slowly. Inside a ward at Alfred Hospital, Judith Durham lay surrounded by family. The voice that had once soared above 500,000 people at the Meyer Music Bowl was now barely a whisper. The room itself was quiet, but not empty. The soft beeping of monitors, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the rustle of blankets, these were the sounds that framed her final hours. A small transistor radio sat in the corner, faintly playing ABC News updates. For those at her bedside, the hum of her country's voice seemed fitting. Judith had been part of Australia's soundtrack for 6 decades. She had battled bronchiectasis since childhood, a chronic condition that shadowed her life. In her later years, it grew more difficult, her lungs less forgiving. Friends recalled her determination, how she continued to sing and record despite the strain. But that August day, her body could carry her no further. Motifs from her youth seemed to return. Family spoke of the piano she first touched in Essendon, the jazz clubs where she discovered her voice, the endless sea of faces at the bowl. In the hospital's dim light, those memories felt close, almost within reach. It was as though her life's music, every note, every ovation, had gathered to form a final chord. News broke quickly. Within hours, ABC announced, Australia's beloved songbird Judith Durham has passed away, aged 79. The words echoed across televisions and phones, pulling people back to a time when the Seekers had been more than entertainment. They had been a nation's proof of place in the world. Imagine that moment. Across the suburbs of Melbourne, in cafes of Sydney, in homes scattered from Perth to Hobart, radios replayed, "I'll Never Find Another You." The same melody that once climbed to the top of Britain's charts now carried the weight of farewell. Listeners closed their eyes, and for a heartbeat, it felt as though Judith was still here, still singing, still promising that we would never find another voice like hers. At the hospital, there was no fanfare, no grand stage. Only family, love, and silence. It was a final moment that contrasted starkly with the roaring ovations of her youth. From 100,000 voices at the bowl to the hush of one hospital room, her story had come full circle. And so the nation grieved. The girl from Essendon, who had once carried Australia onto the world stage, had reached the end of her journey. But as with all icons, her passing raised questions. How could a single voice hold so much meaning for so many? And what does it say about a country when the silence after her song feels like the silence of history itself pausing? When the news of Judith Durham's death broke, the official explanation was clear. She passed away from complications of bronchiectasis, the chronic lung condition she had battled since childhood. Doctors at Melbourne's Alfred Hospital confirmed it was a tragic but natural conclusion to an illness she had endured for decades. But as with so many public figures, clarity did not stop speculation. Media outlets began weaving their own narratives. Headlines in the Sydney Morning Herald and on the ABC spoke of Australia's voice falling silent, framing her death as both personal tragedy and national symbol. Journalists revisited her medical history, the car accident in 1990, the years caring for her husband, Ron Edgeworth, and suggested that these hardships had weakened her long before 2022. Some painted the picture of a woman who had been quietly resilient, carrying burdens that audiences never saw. And then came the whispers, the rumors that tend to gather in the wake of any great loss. Some fans on social media questioned whether she had received the best possible care. Others wondered if her years of performing, of singing despite fragile lungs, had hastened her decline. There were even suggestions that she had concealed the severity of her illness to avoid alarming her fan base. None of these theories were substantiated, and those close to her pushed back firmly. Friends emphasized that Judith had been open about her health struggles, and that she had received the highest level of medical attention. They insisted that her final days were dignified, surrounded by love. Yet, speculation persisted, because Judith Durham was not just another singer. She was a national treasure. And when such figures die, the public instinctively searches for meaning, for a narrative that fits the enormity of the loss. Was her passing simply the quiet close of a long and remarkable life? Or was it, in some ineffable way, the end of an era in which Australian voices first found recognition on the world stage? The showdown of interpretations remained. On one side, the official fact of a lifelong illness finally claiming its toll. On the other, the media's sweeping narratives and the fans' whispered doubts. The truth, as often, lay somewhere between, in the way a voice can be both mortal and eternal, fragile and indestructible. And so the questions linger. What really silenced Judith Durham? Was it the illness named in her medical records? Or was it the weight of decades spent carrying the hopes of a nation in her song? In the days after Judith Durham's passing, Australia entered a collective hush. News bulletins ran tribute segments. Radio stations replayed the Seeker's catalog, and social media filled with grainy clips of her singing before roaring crowds. What struck many was not just the memory of her voice, but the reminder of what it had meant. A soundtrack to Australia's emergence on the world stage. The government quickly announced a state memorial. At Melbourne's Hamer Hall, thousands gathered. Some came dressed in 1960s fashions, clutching vinyl records worn at the edges. Others were younger, grandchildren of those who had first swooned to "I'll Never Find Another You." On the stage, photographs of Judith, as a young girl, as the radiant lead of the Seekers, as a dignified elder, cycled slowly. The hall filled with silence until her voice, replayed through the speakers, soared again. Even in absence, she commanded presence. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese described her as a national treasure and an Australian icon. The Premier of Victoria called her the voice of a generation. At that memorial, it was clear Judith Durham had become more than a performer. She was a cultural landmark, stitched into the nation's identity like the Opera House skyline or the MCG on a summer's day. Where were you when you first heard Georgy Girl? For many Australians, the memory is vivid. Car radios humming on long coastal drives, ABC broadcasts on Sunday mornings, cassette players in school halls. Her music wasn't just performed, it was lived, woven into the texture of everyday lives. Her legacy extended beyond the records. The Seekers had paved the way for every Australian artist who followed, showing that distance was no barrier, that even from Melbourne or Sydney, the world could be reached. For Olivia Newton-John, for Kylie Minogue, for countless others, the path Judith helped carve remained vital. And then there was the motif that returned, again and again, applause and silence. From the roar of 200,000 at the Meyer Music Bowl to the hush of the Memorial Hall, Judith's journey was one of contrasts. Each ovation seemed to foreshadow the silence that would one day come. And now, in remembering, those silences became as powerful as the songs themselves. In the end, Judith Durham left more than music. She left an afterglow, a remembrance that continues to shimmer in the Australian imagination. Her voice may no longer ring out live, but its echo still lingers. In recordings, in memories, in the collective heartbeat of a nation that once dared to believe it could be heard. It began with a song that felt impossibly light. Georgy Girl, skipping across radios, across oceans. And it ended with silence. A hospital room in Melbourne where that songbird finally rested. Applause and silence, light and shadow. These motifs defined Judith Durham's journey, and now they close it. Australia had found in her a voice that was both familiar and extraordinary, rooted in suburbia, yet soaring across the globe. She embodied a nation learning to speak, to sing, to be noticed. Her passing did not erase that legacy. If anything, it amplified it, reminding us that the measure of a life is not only in the ovations, but in the echoes that remain once the hall has emptied. So what do we carry forward? Perhaps it is the memory of a song playing in the car on a long coastal drive. Perhaps it is the image of a young woman standing before 200,000 people, her voice unshaken. Or perhaps it is simply the knowledge that we will never find another like her. What about you? Do you remember the first time you heard Judith Durham sing? Maybe on vinyl, maybe on ABC, maybe in a family living room as the radio hummed. Share those memories with us, because in telling them, in passing them on, we keep her voice alive. Judith Durham's final moment may have been quiet, but her afterglow still lingers. A nation once defined by her song now holds her silence. And in that silence, her music plays on.